Thank you all those who are joining us online for this session on social sciences oral abstract presentation session 1. Our first presenter is Richard Elliott, a research associate at the HIV/AIDS Legal Network. And Richard is going to talk to us on not legally safe sex, the criminalization of HIV non-disclosure disputes despite condom use in Canada. Richard, you can share your screen and take it from there. Go ahead, we can hear you.
Should be unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. I hope you can see the screen.
We can see it well.
Thank you. Thanks to the CAHR organizers for the opportunity to present today. I'm presenting to you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and ceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm based in Halifax. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this presentation who are listed here on the screen from the HIV Legal Network, COCSIDA, and the HIV and AIDS Legal Clinic Ontario. What I'd like to do is give you very briefly a summary overview of the current state of the law as it relates to HIV criminalization, and then focus in specifically on the current legal status of condom use and what it means for potential prosecution of people living with HIV in cases of alleged HIV non-disclosure. I then want to turn to a few of the concerns that are raised by the current state of the law and come to some conclusions about what should happen next. So the first thing to be aware of is that our criminal law is federal law. It is the federal criminal code that applies throughout the country, but it is largely administered, that is enforced, by the 10 provincial governments under our constitutional division of powers. So there are 10 different provincial attorneys general and their designated crown prosecutors who are responsible for prosecuting criminal offenses. The federal government prosecutes criminal code offenses in the 3 territories, and this is relevant for how we go about changing the current problematic state of the law. It's also important to understand that there is no HIV-specific provision in the criminal code criminalizing HIV non-disclosure, exposure, or transmission. Rather, HIV criminalization has occurred through the judicial interpretation of existing provisions in the criminal code of general application, several of which are listed here. And in particular, the offense of aggravated sexual assault is by far and away the charge that has most often been used in Canada to prosecute people for alleged non-disclosure of HIV. It's important to understand how that has come about through judicial interpretation because it's very directly relevant to the issue of the continued criminalization of people for not disclosing even when they have used condoms. The specific legal theory at play behind aggravated sexual assault charges is that to obtain consent to sex from your sexual partner through fraud is one of the ways in which you can, in law, commit sexual assault. And the Supreme Court of Canada has a number of times affirmed that not disclosing one's HIV positive status to a sexual partner can, in some circumstances, amount to fraud. And therefore, the consent of your partner to sex is not legally valid. So what is on its face an otherwise consensual sexual encounter, so we're not talking cases of forced or coerced sex, but otherwise consensual sex, becomes in law a matter of sexual assault. So what are those circumstances? The Supreme Court of Canada has said that there is a duty to disclose one's HIV positive status to sexual partners when there is, before you engage in activity that in the court's view carries a significant risk of serious bodily harm. And more specifically, in the context of HIV, as opposed to other sexually transmitted infections, the court has clarified that this legal test means that there must be a realistic possibility of HIV transmission. That is the key phrase here. And the fact that you have not disclosed to a sexual partner when there is a realistic possibility of transmission is actually linked to their decision to consent to sex. So they would not have consented to sex had they known that their partner was HIV positive. Because the courts consider that exposing someone to the risk of acquiring HIV amounts to endangerment of life, this, as a matter of law, means that the sexual assault actually becomes elevated to the most serious form of sexual assault, and that is an aggravated sexual assault. So that is the current legal framework, and the key phrase there, as I've mentioned, is the realistic possibility of HIV transmission. So when is there such a possibility that would trigger a duty to disclose, which means that you are potentially a criminal if you do not disclose? There are a number of specific circumstances that obviously come to mind. Some of them have come before the courts or have been the subject of some decision-making by prosecuting authorities. And the first thing to note is that in cases where someone has a low viral load, which the courts have considered to mean under 1,500 copies of the virus per milliliter, and a condom is used, so we're talking about penetrative vaginal or anal sex here, the Supreme Court of Canada has said that in that circumstance, in their view, there is no realistic possibility of transmitting HIV sexually, and therefore there's no duty to disclose, and therefore there is no crime of sexual assault if you do not disclose. Since that decision from the Supreme Court of Canada 10 years ago, there have been a number of developments, and in both prosecutorial policy in a number of jurisdictions and in some decided court rulings, there has been an acceptance of the science that if someone has an undetectable or a suppressed viral load, then that in and of itself is sufficient to mean that there is no realistic possibility of transmission. And so that too is a circumstance in which there is little prospect of a conviction happening, and probably little prospect these days of a prosecution even being started. That's not clearly stated in every jurisdiction in the country. You'll see here on the screen the jurisdictions in which prosecutorial policy has actually spoken to this issue. They are the federal jurisdictions, so the 3 territories, and in Ontario and BC. There have also been some court decisions in Nova Scotia and in Ontario in which people who have been charged have been acquitted in relation to certain sexual acts on the basis that their viral load was undetectable or suppressed, and therefore there was no obligation to disclose their status. There is relatively little in the way of clear commentary or clear court decisions on the oral sex point, and it doesn't come up that often. But it is probably the case that someone who engages only in oral sex is not likely to be prosecuted for not disclosing their HIV positive status, because in those circumstances, likely the realistic possibility of HIV transmission is not going to be satisfied. So one of the major outstanding questions is the question of whether condom use alone can suffice. You recall that I said that in the Supreme Court of Canada decision of 10 years ago, the court was prepared to accept that condom use plus the HIV positive partner having a low viral load was enough to mean that there was no duty to disclose. But the question of whether a condom used on its own, regardless of one's viral load, would be sufficient to mean that you do not have a duty to disclose and therefore you are not a criminal for not disclosing is actually more contested, and both the law as it stands now and the prosecutorial practice are uneven and unsettled. Specifically, it's worth noting that in a directive adopted by the Federal Attorney General in 2018, the direction to federal prosecutors, so this applies in the 3 territories, is that generally in those cases there should not be a prosecution for alleged non-disclosure, because likely the realistic possibility of HIV transmission test is not satisfied. The BC Prosecution Service has also said that condom use may be a factor that weighs against prosecution when the prosecution is considering in each given case whether it is in the public interest to take forward a certain prosecution, but it is not a definitive statement to that effect. And in Ontario, the only other jurisdiction that has actually adopted a specific policy dealing with HIV-related prosecutions, despite the urging of advocates, the policy that was ultimately issued by the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General is decidedly silent on that point. And in fact, if you look at the conflicting court rulings across the country on this subject, Ontario is the jurisdiction in which there has been most recently a pronouncement by the courts, and specifically from the Ontario Court of Appeal, so the highest court in Ontario, in which the court expressly rejected the argument that a condom alone should be sufficient to mean that you have not committed sexual assault when you don't disclose your HIV positive status to a partner. That is not a particularly encouraging decision and raises a number of concerns, which I'll turn to in a moment. But I think it is also worth remembering that courts in some other jurisdictions, and in particular in Nova Scotia, have actually reached the opposite conclusion, which is why I have noted that there are conflicting court rulings on this subject. In fact, in Nova Scotia, a trial court in Nova Scotia, in a decision later upheld by the Court of Appeal in Nova Scotia, has concluded that condom use means there is no realistic possibility of transmission, and therefore acquitted the person. So we have these conflicting court rulings, and we have some somewhat different approaches in prosecutorial policy. So there are a number of concerns that obviously remain given this state of the law. And the first set of concerns have to do with the science, and that the refusal to accept that condom use alone means that people should not be prosecuted for non-disclosure is at odds with the science, and as that science should be applied given the current legal test, at least in theory. And here I want to point to the international expert consensus statement that was issued by 20 HIV experts from around the world and endorsed by UNAIDS and the International AIDS Society, amongst others, in which they reviewed the state of the science and characterized the possibility of transmission in a number of different categories. And this is what they had to say specifically about condom use. And I've highlighted here the key conclusion, which is that correct use of a condom during sex means that HIV transmission is not possible. Their definition of correct condom use means that the integrity of the condom is not compromised, and it's worn throughout the sex act in question. And we know that, in fact, obviously, that given the properties of HIV and of latex and polyurethane and similar substances, condoms, that HIV will not pass through that barrier, and therefore there is zero risk of transmission. The consensus statement goes on to characterize the possibility of HIV transmission in the case where the HIV positive partner, or when a condom is used, in the case of a serodiscordant couple, the risk varies from none to negligible, depending on the context. And their estimate, based on the then available science, was that if a condom is used, then we're talking about a possibility of transmission that is less than 2 in 10,000. So I would suggest that this is a speculative risk of transmission that is exactly the sort of risk that the Supreme Court of Canada said in its decision should not, in fact, be subject to the criminal law. So there are also a number of human rights and public policy concerns that accompany the scientific concerns. And the first of those is that, in our view, the criminalization of people living with HIV, even in the case where they've used condoms with their sexual partners, is unfair on a number of grounds. The first is that it punishes an individual person not based on their own proven conduct that is proven to pose a significant risk of serious harm, which is the legal test, but it's based on the presumption that HIV transmission was still a possibility because there is a possibility that the condom might break. So these are based on population level estimates of condom use that are fine at a population level, but we have to remember that we're talking about prosecutions for one individual act against one individual. And so the case in Ontario that I mentioned a short while ago was a case in which someone had in fact used a condom on all encounters. There was no evidence that the condom had broken and no allegation that HIV had been transmitted. And yet this person was convicted of aggravated sexual assault for what was otherwise a consensual sexual encounter and subject to 4 years in prison. Which brings me to the point that this is a very harsh criminal sanction that is imposed even in the absence of a moral blameworthiness, such as an intent to actually cause harm, and in a circumstance in which the science tells us there is either no or at most negligible possibility of harm. And the lower the harm and the closer to zero that it is, the more this is an instance of the state discriminating through the criminal law based on HIV status as opposed to actual harm or serious risk of harm. Two other human rights concerns that I'll touch on briefly is that this overextension of the criminal law actually compounds or has an additional discriminatory impact, particularly against Black people, Indigenous people, and gay people. Black men in particular are disproportionately represented in the HIV criminalization prosecutions based on some recent analysis from the HIV Legal Network. And Indigenous women and gay men are other communities over whom the threat of HIV criminalization hangs disproportionately. It also ignores some of the gender dimensions of sexual encounters in many instances and the gendered harms of HIV criminalization, including that those people who may be in a position or not in a position to insist on condom use may also be in that position or in a position for those very same reasons to not actually disclose their HIV positive status. The final reason is that overly extending the criminal law amounts to poor public health policy, because to criminalize instances in which there is no or negligible risk of transmission and where people do not have any intent to transmit contributes to continued societal misinformation about HIV and exaggerated perceptions of how it is transmissible, which then, of course, further exacerbates the stigma surrounding HIV, and the threat of criminal prosecution, the broader that it is, creates additional disincentives to people seeking HIV testing, all of which are ultimately to the detriment of public health. A few key conclusions, and then I'll stop. So given the state of the law and prosecutorial policy as it currently stands, people living with HIV are uncertain about whether they risk criminal prosecution if they do not disclose. And people, given what I've described of the legal and policy landscape across the country, also face a differential risk of criminal prosecution in cases where they've used condoms, depending on which jurisdiction they live in or have had a sexual encounter in the country. Neither of those are particularly desirable situations. And I think the fact that we have this unsettled and uneven prosecutorial practice in the face of some fairly clear scientific and human rights arguments for limiting HIV criminalization means that Parliament really needs to act now. This is yet another reason that Parliament needs to act to amend the Federal Criminal Code. And in doing so, should, amongst other things, explicitly preclude the prosecution of someone under any provision of the code where that person has used a condom in their sexual encounter. And this would be consistent with the number of recommendations and calls from different quarters over the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. We ran out of time, so we are going to move to the next presenter, Teresa and Abe, if you can. So you have 10 minutes and 5 minutes for questions. If you run over your time, no questions.
So I'm just going to share my screen.
So I will go away and show up 8 minutes, 1 minute, right? But then if we progress, then we have the 5 minutes for your questions.
Perfect. Okay, Teresa, ready to go? All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abby from St. Michael's Hospital, Toronto, and together with my colleagues, Teresa and Jason, we'll be discussing our project that focuses on the impact of intersectionality on HIV-related stigma within key populations. So to begin, previous research has shown that HIV disproportionately affects specific populations, including men who have sex with men, African, Caribbean, and Black individuals, Indigenous communities, and women. Individuals at the intersection of multiple identities, such as a man who identifies as both African and bisexual, face different challenges as a person living with or at risk of HIV. However, much of the literature on intersectionality within HIV overlooks the intersections between different social categories and thus treats them as mutually exclusive groups. Despite there being substantial evidence on the negative health impacts of HIV-related stigma, there is minimal research that explores the intersection of HIV-related stigma in tandem with other forms of stigma. With this, intersectionality theory provides a framework that describes how people with multiple social identities have lived experiences that are distinct from any single group. So what is HIV-related stigma? Within our study, we broke down HIV-related stigma into three main constructs. So firstly, we have internalized stigma, which is defined as the endorsement of negative thoughts or beliefs around HIV and applying them to the self. Secondly, we have enacted stigma, which is defined as the experience of discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping due to the HIV status. And lastly, we have anticipated stigma, which is defined as expectations that others will treat you negatively because of your HIV status. For each of these definitions, you can see an example on the right-hand side. So why does this all matter? Once again, not much is known on how intersecting identities affects the level of HIV stigma those with multiple identities experience. By applying the intersectionality framework to HIV, research could reveal a more comprehensive view of the root causes of these disparities experienced by the people living with HIV and who identify with multiple social identities. This can allow for better access to care, testing, and support for those who are disproportionately impacted, and ultimately help to ensure that everyone has at least the same access or is on a level playing field.
With this, our research objective of interest focuses on quantitatively exploring whether having multiple intersecting social identities related to gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation impacts levels of HIV-related stigmas amongst people living with HIV and how these affect health outcomes. So moving into talking about the People Living with HIV Stigma Index, it was a mixed method survey innovatively designed by and for people living with HIV. Overall, a total of 1,115 participants were recruited across Canada, and the administration of the survey was done via face-to-face interviews, which lasted approximately 2 hours in length and were conducted by a total of 40 peer researchers. All in all, it was an iterative knowledge transfer and exchange process with peer researcher and community involvement being at the forefront of the study execution. Our sample was based on the priority populations who are most affected by HIV, and as such, we were able to note intersecting populations by gender, sexual orientation, and race and ethnicity. So our intersecting population groups included a cross of males and females, those who identify as being heterosexual, gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and those who identify as being ACP, Indigenous, or Caucasian. Unfortunately, certain groups which are indicated by an asterisk on the slide were not included in our analysis. This is because the limited data within these groups didn't allow for us to conduct a sound statistical analysis as separate groups, as you will see on slides 8 and 9. And we also didn't want to lump them together into another group as we felt that would capture their valued experiences. But this is definitely something that we would like to rectify in future studies by having more specific recruitment methods which target and focus on these groups. And for our analysis, we examined the interactions of interest in a stepwise manner. So referring to the figures shown on the slide, we first started with a multiple regression in which we tried to draw out a relationship between our dependent variable, which is Y, and in this case, that's HIV-related stigma, and each of our multiple independent variables, which in this case is gender, which is W, sexual orientation, which is X, and ethnicity, which is Z. We then did two-way interactions, which looked at the joint effect of our two independent variables. So for example, the joint effect of sexual orientation and gender together on our dependent variable. These are denoted by the boxes XW, WZ, and XZ. Finally, we did three-way interactions to understand how the intersections of ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation all together affected experiences of HIV-related stigma, which is denoted by the box XWZ. Age and location were controlled for in this case. And in interpreting the results, we'll be focusing on the three-way interactions, as any significance within those interactions accounts for all of our previous analyses also.
So moving over to our results, we have this descriptive statistics shown here. These stats are all broken down by province, such that red represents Ontario, blue represents Alberta, and yellow represents Quebec. Within our sample, the average age for Ontario was 48 years old and was 49 years old for Alberta and 52 years old for Quebec. For both Ontario and Alberta, the average individual was living with HIV for 15 years in comparison to Quebec, which was 19 years. Looking at gender, each province was relatively similar, such that males represented about 2/3 of the sample, females were about 1/3, and then there was a little less of other categories, which included trans women and trans men. Here we display the other two social identities that were of relevance in our study, and this includes sexual orientation and ethnicity. In regards to sexual orientation, Ontario and Quebec had just a bit more people who identified as gay and bisexual than heterosexual, whereas Alberta had the opposite. Each of the three provinces had a small representation of other sexual orientations, which included participants who identified as pansexual, queer, asexual, questioning, and two-spirit. Looking at ethnicity, majority of our sample came from each province was Caucasian, with ACB and Indigenous individuals representing around 25% each. Each province also had a small representation of other ethnicities, and this includes Asian, Pacific Islander, and Latinx individuals. To look at our sample with a little more detail, we present this mosaic plot that categorically displays 18 intersecting groups we looked at. Each social identity is represented on one side, such that the gender is on the left, sexual orientation is on top, and ethnicity is on the right. Within this figure, where each of the three identities intersect is the representation of one of the intersecting groups. So for example, the top left box represents those who identify as male, heterosexual, and Caucasian. Within this plot, the size of each box represents the number of individuals that are within that intersecting group. So to point out a few key groups, those who identify as male, gay, and Caucasian, as well as female, heterosexual, and ACB make up a large proportion of our sample. And this is in comparison to those who identify as female, lesbian, and ACB, or Indigenous, as they make up a small proportion of our sample. So here we have a plot to visualize our three-way interaction results. Within this plot, each of the three stigmas is on the right-hand side, sexual orientation is on the left, on the left, ethnicity is on the left, and lastly, gender is on top. So for example, the top left circle represents the overall anticipated stigma scores for those who identify as male, Indigenous, and heterosexual. The color of the circle corresponds to the stigma scale gradient on the right-hand side, such that yellow is the higher stigma scores, and whereas the darker blue is the lower stigma scores. So starting off with anticipated stigma results, you can see that ACB group as a whole seems to have higher anticipated scores compared to the Indigenous and Caucasian groups. This result is even more pronounced for ACB females, and this is in comparison to the males. Adding in sexual orientation, those who identify as ACB, female, and lesbian seem to have the highest anticipated stigma score compared to all other groups. Looking at our enacted stigma results, this plot displays relatively similar stigma scores across most groups. However, we do see higher scores for some. So firstly, those who identify as ACB, female, and either lesbian or bisexual have slightly higher scores compared to the other groups. And then at an even higher level, we see that Indigenous, lesbian, females experience the greatest amount of enacted stigma compared to others. Within this three-way interaction analysis, this specific group produced significant results.
In terms of internalized stigma, most distinctly, there appears to be differences in the levels of stigma experienced by those who identify as female, lesbian, and ACB, followed closely by those who identify as female, lesbian, and Indigenous, and those who identify as female, bisexual, and ACB. There is less variation in stigma scores seen amongst those who identify as males. Overall, it appeared that the female groups had slightly more variation across the three stigmas, and that anticipated stigma scores were slightly higher, with enacted stigma and then internalized stigma falling behind it. However, it is also worth noting that the lower scores within the internalized stigma category could have been attributed to the fact that this stigma may be harder to identify and actually verbalize for participants. Also, Caucasian, gay, and bisexual males seem to be doing better overall across the three stigmas in comparison to the other groups, and this may be an indication that the longstanding research and stigma interventions directed towards these groups have been effective and could potentially be used to lessen the stigma experience within some of the other groups. So in conclusion, the results demonstrate that there are high levels of HIV-related stigma across groups, and we recognize that understanding which groups are doing better or worse may help with creating targeted interventions and assessing what methods work to combat stigma and what methods do not. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, this study is novel in the quantitative methodology used to examine intersectionality theory as it relates to HIV-related stigma. Therefore, we hope that future intersectionality research can continue to develop and utilize these and other quantitative and qualitative methods together.
Our current study was general in nature in that we had a large sample size that allowed us to get a general picture of how people living with HIV's experiences of stigmas are impacted by their identities. However, moving forward, intersectionality research can aim to look at these specific intersecting groups individually and examine their certain needs and experiences of stigma within the groups. This includes gathering larger sample sizes of each social identity to ensure all are represented equally. Overall, our study is just the beginning of what needs to be examined in regards to intersectionality and HIV-related stigma. Thank you for listening.
Very good. We have a couple of minutes for questions in the discussion if you want to raise a question. Anybody with a question? Those online, you can type your question on there. Only see a thumbs up. If there's no question, Abby, I will ask a question. So what are you planning to do next with this?
I think I can take a stab at that one. So I think next we would like to dive deeper into the individual groups. As we mentioned a few times, we weren't able to look at the other categories as there wasn't enough to analyze them properly. So I think we'd like to dive into those specific individuals and perform a similar analysis. As Teresa mentioned, we used qualitative and quantitative, so it's an interesting method. And I think, yeah, diving into those groups with what we've done would be probably a next step that we'd like to take. I don't know if Teresa, if you have anything to add.
And also, even some of the groups that we did analyze, such as ACB individuals, even as Abby mentioned, diving into those, because even within those categories, there are differences. I am of Caribbean descent, and my experiences may be different than those of somebody who is of African descent. So even diving deeper into the groups that we have categorized, we think would be beneficial, and that's definitely something that we would like to do in the future.
So are you working with any of the community organizations in the Toronto area?
Sorry?
Are you working with any of the community HIV organizations in the Toronto area, the local groups?
Yes, we're associated with Reach Nexus, and Reach Nexus does have a broad reach and many connections with some of the community HIV groups, and so there will be collaboration there.
All right, thank you very much. Good job. We will move to our next presenter.
Thank you.
I have to go back and find out. That will be, how to call it, Rola. Yeah, and Rola will be talking to us about gay and bisexual Middle Eastern and North African diaspora youth navigating sex, desire, and health in Ontario, Canada. Findings from the Mena study.
Thank you.
Yeah, you have 10 minutes and plus 5 minutes.
Okay, are you able to see my full screen?
Yep.
Okay, excellent.
I will come back up when you have probably 1 or 2 minutes left in your presentation.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to the CAHR organizing committee for this opportunity. Thank you for coming out to today's presentation. My name is Rula Hawa. I'm an assistant professor at Brescia University College at Western University. I'm also the principal investigator for the Mena study. The title of today's presentation is Gay and Bisexual Middle Eastern and North African Diaspora Youth, Navigating Sex, Desire and Health in Ontario, Canada, Findings from the Mena study. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Vijaya Shikermani, Olesya Felinchak, Basma Mu'mini, Ahmed Azzuddin, Anmar Al-Azzawi, Moa'el, Rama Al-Ulabi, Tina Pahlavan, Lina Hamad, Mazen Al-Baba, and Mona Lutfi. I disclose no conflict of interest. I acknowledge the support received from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research for funding the Mena study. As an immigrant and settler in Canada, I would like to acknowledge the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lunapewek, and Arawandaran peoples, all of whom have longstanding relationships to the land of Southwestern Ontario and the City of London, where I'm currently situated. This is part of sustained practice in decolonizing our lives and work. So what does YASMINA stand for? The acronym YASMINA is Youth, Sexual Health and HIV Prevention in Diaspora, Middle Eastern and North African Communities in Canada. YASMINA is the first study in Canada that centers MENA youth voices. It's part of a research program whose aim is to promote resilience and well-being in a highly underserved youth population. The program has received additional funding from CAHR and more work is underway in Ontario and BC. So why HIV prevention in the MENA region? According to UNAIDS, the rise in new infections since 2001 has put the MENA region among the top regions in the world with the fastest growing rates of HIV infections globally. These global trends have implications in the Canadian landscape. The 2016 census reports that immigrants to Canada from Middle Eastern countries, mostly Arabs and West Asians, are expected to increase the most rapidly between 2006 and 2031 and more than triple in the next 25 years. So why MENA youth? Youth in general, especially LGBTQ+ youth, immigrants and refugees bear a disproportionate burden of STIs and HIV due to structural barriers resulting in social and economic marginalization. A recent scoping review published in 2022 and conducted by our team indicates that there are relevant factors for increased risk for MENA youth, and these are all listed. There's unprotected sex, lack of access to ART, lack of access to HIV testing, overlapping risky behaviors among youth who inject drugs, lack of harm reduction facilities, socioeconomic variables that impact key populations, and definitely very, very important, severe stigma. Moreover, there's a major gap in sexual health knowledge tools and culturally relevant resources to serve this vulnerable youth population in a Canadian context. Let's look at the study design. So this is a community-based research study. We used a mixed methods design where data was collected using a quantitative survey and qualitative focus groups with 56 MENA youth ages 16 to 29 years in Ontario. We used a peer leadership model whereby 6 trained peer research associates facilitated 14 sequential critical dialogical focus groups with youth subgroups including gay and bisexual cis men, heterosexual cis men, heterosexual cis women, queer cis women, and trans women. Each group participated in 2 focus group sessions, hence sequential dialogical approach, to understand 1, youth sexual health behaviors and cultural identity, and in the second focus group, to gather participant recommendations for interventions. An additional focus group centered solely on interventions was conducted, making this for a total of 15 focus groups. And as you can see here, today's presentation is focused on the MSM focus groups. So here's an overview of quantitative results from the study, only reporting on some because of definitely the time constraints. First of all, we have 22 gay and MSM self-identified MENA youth participated in 6 focus groups. Most respondents, 65%, identified their ethnicity as Arab, with 60% of them as Middle Eastern and 5% North African, 20% identified as Farsi, Middle Eastern Iranians, and the rest identified as multi-ethnic. In terms of age, the average age was 27 years, standard deviation 1.59, and the range was 21 to 29 years. We didn't have anyone younger than 21. And that's an interesting stat around the years in Canada. 50% have been in Canada for 4 to 9 years, and none had lived in Canada most of their lives. And of course, that speaks volumes about the population being mostly immigrants and newcomers. So let's look at PrEP use. About half of the respondents indicated that they were not taking PrEP. With respect to decisions about the future use of PrEP, opinions were split. 60% are very likely to take PrEP in the future, 13% are likely to use it, 20% were undecided, and almost 70% are very unlikely to use PrEP. As we can see from the bar graph, the most commonly reported sources of sexual health information were internet resources such as Google search, Reddit groups, WebMD, and Mayo Clinic, followed by doctors and nurses, same percentage, 52.9%. Friends were also a source of information, and other sources mentioned by participants included podcasts. When it comes to sexual practices, most respondents indicated having multiple practices. As can be seen again from the bar graph, most MSM participants practice masturbation, kissing, and oral and anal sex. Let's look at some findings from the qualitative data. One of the emerging themes of key finding is homophobia and stigma around race and sexuality. Homophobia was discussed, and experiences of racism and xenophobia were also shared. I have some quotes, but I'm going to let you read the quotes, and I'm just going to provide some context for you. So not surprisingly, there were considerable homophobia that young Mena youth had experienced in their lives, often within their immediate or extended family, that led to exclusion, and clearly because of their sexuality. Experiences of exclusion and at times of violence were shared against the backdrop of migration, religious upbringing, and the journey of being a newcomer to Canada. Here's another quote. Stigma and exclusion was also talked about within the context of xenophobia and or racism, adding to the intersectionality of oppression Mena youth were facing. Youth mentioned rampant anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia. They also talked about lack of employment opportunities despite holding many high qualifications from Canadian universities. They attributed that to systemic racism. Another key theme is about pressures related to dating and acceptance in the gay community. And here's another quote. Participants talked about people feeling pressure to engage in sexual activity or use substances to feel more accepted and desirable. For example, youth talked about party and play to attract more people online or feel included in white gay spaces. This was also connected to shame and issues of body image and perceptions placed on Arab bodies. A group of youth mentioned that the Mena community does not lack awareness of HIV and its impact, but yet the gay and MSM Mena community, or a large percentage, engages in the use of drugs, condomless sex, non-PrEP use, group sex, etc., which is mostly to feel desired and seek acceptance from mainstream gay youth. Another key theme centers around mental health and safe, accessible healthcare. Mental health challenges was a central theme in all focus groups. For the MSM group in particular, youth talked about mental health supports that could be beneficial in the community and discussed the lack of mentorship and support in LGBTQ spaces as a factor that could lead people to engaging in higher risk sexual activity. Another key theme is about PrEP and HIV. Understandably, this group was more familiar with PrEP and issues related to HIV and spoke comfortably about their experiences and peers. Many talked about misinformation surrounding PrEP among peers in the context of either how it can be taken or about who might have access to it. Participants discussed the need for more awareness and education. So now what? What are the study implications? Centering youth voices, there are some suggestions, and these were offered by the MSM Mena youth for interventions. And I'll put a plug for tomorrow's presentation. I'm focusing mostly on interventions if you want to join me in tomorrow's presentation in the afternoon. And it'll be not just MSM youth, but all youth. So the first suggested intervention by gay and MSM Mena youth was about mental health support for men. Youth discussed mental health support for men in the community that could take shape as mentorship and peer support networks for young men. Youth also suggested education, specifically related to party and play, to ensure that young men knew what it meant on dating apps and profiles. Youth talked about interventions focused on strong negotiation skills. They talked about coercion into having unprotected sex and the importance of equipping young men with strong negotiation skills to make informed choices about their sexual activity. Finally, youth mentioned interventions using social media and gay men's apps. In particular, many youth talked about Grindr as a gay men's app. They indicated that Grindr can play a crucial role in promoting healthy sexual behaviors for Mena youth if they run the ads in culturally relevant ways using most popular Mena languages, Arabic or Farsi. And I've come to the end of this presentation. I would like to acknowledge the peer research associates who played a crucial role in the study. Sincere gratitude to all the Mena youth who participated in this study. Many thanks to our community and academic partners who supported the study for the past 2 years. And to the Mena youth, we're making sure your voices are heard. And here are our references. Thank you for being a great audience. You can reach me by email, and I have a Twitter handle, and you can also follow Yasmina on Twitter, on Instagram, and we do have a website that has housed a lot of our findings. And now I will open it up for Q&A.
So we have a few minutes for a couple of questions. If you have a question, if you could type it in. So if there's no question, Royla, I'm going to ask my own question. So I am actually in Western, if you notice. I'm right across the campus from Russia, right?
Ah, okay.
Good job. Yeah. So are you working with, let's say, the London local AHAC, the regional HIV connection in downtown, or?
Yes, you know what? They are one of our community partners on both studies. We got a study, we got funding for a scoping review and a summit, and also for the Catalyst grant, this particular study. They're not very directly involved, but definitely I would love to have them more involved. I know the ED is just a matter of inviting people and seeing more common interests, but definitely they supported the study.
What about a cross-cultural community center?
They're also on the, you don't want to know how many community partners I have on the study, a lot. They all help with the recruitment. Again, if Isaac, I'm more than happy if you want to make more connections for me for future funding. I would love to connect with more people in London. Both were good partners, but again, not very actively involved just because it's a lot of partners and people are busy. But I would love to have both of them very involved for sure.
All right, we have time for one more question, at least. Anybody else? Otherwise, we'll say thank you so much, Rola. That's great work. We can connect, after all of this, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to Marian.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So Marian is going to talk to us about the history of homosexual species HIV in Quebec and the mobilizing strategies that have been used.
That's right.
Go for it.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of CAHR for inviting me here today to present to you the research I am conducting in the context of my master's degree at the School of Public Health of Université de Montréal. I must warn you that I will be presenting in French, but I will be open to answering questions in English at the end of the presentation if needed. Merci. Donc, mon projet porte sur l'histoire des premières années de la mobilisation dans la lutte contre le VIH-Sida chez les hommes homosexuels au Québec. Cette étude part du constat qu'il existe peu d'études spécifiques sur l'élaboration de la réponse sociale et politique à cette épidémie au Québec, y compris au sein de sa population la plus touchée, c'est-à-dire les hommes gays. Donc, en fait, mon projet vise à combler ce manque historiographique important en documentant cette histoire à partir de la perspective de ses principaux acteurs. Donc, à partir de ce qui a été observé dans d'autres contextes comparables et le peu de données disponibles sur les premières années de l'épidémie du sida au Québec, j'étudiais l'hypothèse d'une implication forte et première des groupes communautaires d'hommes homosexuels et aussi d'un retard potentiel de la mobilisation des pouvoirs publics à l'épidémie. Pour bien appréhender les dimensions sociales de la réponse à l'épidémie du sida, cette étude qualitative s'appuie sur une démarche socio-historique et dans cet esprit, les données mobilisées sont tant des sources documentaires et archivistiques que des sources orales. Donc, en effet, en plus d'une revue de la littérature, j'ai aussi examiné des fonds des archives gays du Québec. Les AGQ sont des archives communautaires fondées en 1983 qui documentent l'histoire de la communauté LGBTQ du Québec. Sinon, il y a aussi 15 entrevues semi-dirigées qui ont été menées auprès de personnes issues des milieux communautaires, scientifiques, politiques et médiatiques qui ont été impliquées durant cette période. Donc, en fait, ce qui ressort, c'est qu'au Québec, les premiers à se mobiliser en réaction au sida sont des professionnels de la santé alarmés par l'apparition des cas de ce qui semble à l'époque être une nouvelle maladie. Donc, il faut nuancer l'hypothèse que j'émettais au début d'une implication forte et première des groupes communautaires d'hommes homosexuels, puisque la mobilisation des professionnels de la santé va devancer celle des communautés touchées. De plus, au Québec, la communauté haïtienne étant la première touchée, elle est également la première à se mobiliser pour faire face à l'épidémie. Et ensuite, on voit les groupes communautaires d'hommes gays qui se mobilisent dans un troisième temps, quelques années après le début de l'épidémie au Québec. En ce qui concerne le gouvernement du Québec, il a d'abord considéré le sida comme étant un problème d'ordre essentiellement médical, alors il est resté en retrait dans les premières années. On observe toutefois un changement de paradigme à partir de la deuxième moitié des années 80, avec une réappropriation de la lutte contre le sida. C'est donc dans ce contexte que le ministère de la Santé et des Services sociaux du Québec rend public en 1987 la première phase de la stratégie québécoise de lutte contre le sida et le Centre de coordination sur le sida et le Centre québécois de coordination sur le sida est fondé en 1989. L'étude a aussi permis de faire ressortir des particularités du contexte québécois qui éclairent sous un nouveau jour l'hypothèse d'une réponse tardive au sida. Donc, il s'agit principalement des tensions entre les paliers de pouvoir, des différences entre les communautés linguistiques anglophones et francophones, ainsi que de la reconnaissance fragile de l'homosexualité dans la société québécoise à cette époque-là. Donc, premièrement, comme je le disais, la mobilisation contre le sida au Québec s'inscrit dans un contexte sociopolitique de tension entre le provincial et le fédéral, notamment en raison des revendications souverainistes du Québec et des projets constitutionnels du Canada. Donc, si les questions de santé, comme vous le savez tous évidemment, sont principalement de compétences provinciales, les deux paliers de gouvernement étaient quand même appelés à collaborer dans la gestion de l'épidémie. Ces tensions ont toutefois conduit au Québec à un climat de non-collaboration entre le fédéral et le provincial, ce qui a notamment contribué à retarder le financement des organismes communautaires. En effet, très tôt, le gouvernement fédéral va fournir de l'argent aux organismes communautaires pourvu que le provincial fournisse également des fonds. Cela dit, au Québec, comme le gouvernement québécois refuse de donner de l'argent aux organismes communautaires jusqu'à la deuxième moitié des années 80, ça a également retardé le cofinancement du fédéral. Sinon, bien sûr, comme vous le savez sûrement aussi, au Québec, on a, et en particulier à Montréal, il y a deux langues qui se côtoient, donc le français et l'anglais. Et dans la lutte contre le sida, en raison de cette cohabitation des langues-là, on a assisté à la création de réseaux communautaires parallèles avec des organisations distinctes pour chacune des deux communautés linguistiques. Donc, le premier organisme communautaire qui s'est constitué pour faire face au sida, qui était du nom de Mark Arms, a été mis sur pied par des anglophones, mais dans la tentative de faire un organisme bilingue. Cela dit, peu de temps après sa création, des hommes gays ayant été impliqués dans la création de Mark Arms se sont associés à des infirmières haïtiennes pour créer un organisme francophone, le Sésame. Donc, selon les fondateurs de cet organisme-là, il y avait plusieurs raisons qui exigeaient la création d'un organisme principalement francophone. Donc, tout d'abord, même si Mark Arms était bilingue, c'était avant tout en théorie, puisque comme il était constitué principalement d'anglophones, il y avait de la difficulté à rejoindre la communauté francophone. De plus, il y avait de la difficulté à les rejoindre pour des raisons linguistiques, mais également géographiques, puisqu'il était situé dans l'ouest de la ville, donc dans le secteur anglophone, alors que le village gay est plutôt situé dans l'est de Montréal. Sinon, il était aussi estimé que le gouvernement du Québec serait plus enclin à donner du financement à un organisme francophone, la Charte de la langue française, ou mieux connue sous la loi 101, qui confirme le français comme la langue officielle unique du Québec, ayant été adoptée quelques années auparavant. Et finalement, un des objectifs était également de stimuler l'implication de la communauté francophone dans la lutte contre le sida, puisque les bénévoles étaient à cette époque-là à majorité anglophone. Donc, quelques années après la création de Sésame, il y a quand même certains membres qui vont trouver cette fois-ci que les anglophones ne sont pas bien desservis au sein de Sésame et qui vont se séparer pour créer un autre organisme du nom de ACCM qui dessert cette fois-ci spécifiquement la communauté anglophone de Montréal. Donc, ces différences au sein du milieu communautaire vont toutefois au-delà d'une simple différence linguistique. Les communautés francophones et anglophones présentent des différences culturelles importantes avec des conceptions et des approches différentes. La relation à la religion est notamment un des éléments qui explique ces différences. Donc, dans les années 60, au Québec, au moment de la Révolution tranquille, on observe un délaissement graduel de la pratique de la religion catholique chez les francophones qui ont fait le choix collectif que l'État allait jouer ce rôle. Alors que dans la communauté anglophone du Québec, l'Église continue de jouer un rôle très important comme centre de soutien dans l'esprit de la charité et de la communauté. Et cette différence de perception se reflète d'ailleurs dans le financement des organismes communautaires. Donc, les organismes francophones ont beaucoup de difficultés à aller chercher des fonds au sein de la communauté au moment où il y a peu de subventions disponibles au gouvernement et ils n'hésitent pas à aller en prendre donc, au niveau du gouvernement dès que ça devient possible, alors qu'à l'inverse, les organismes anglophones sont financés à même la communauté pendant très longtemps, donc ils vont être très fiers là, pendant plusieurs années de ne pas prendre l'argent du gouvernement. Sinon, il y a aussi donc une radicalisation, bien sûr, de la mobilisation communautaire qui survient vers la fin des années 80 avec des mouvements de revendication à majorité anglophone comme Réaction Sida et ACT UP Montréal, comme on l'a vu aussi à l'échelle du Canada. Et donc, en fait, ces mouvements-là vont traduire aussi les différences culturelles entre francophones et anglophones. Donc, comme je le disais, ces mouvements sont portés par les anglophones à l'image de ce qui se faisait aux États-Unis et dans le reste du Canada. Donc, ils n'ont pas été en mesure de rallier la communauté francophone qui avait une approche beaucoup moins provocatrice, plus ancrée dans la négociation. Donc, c'est pour cette raison qu'au Québec, ces mouvements ont eu de la difficulté à perdurer dans le temps. Donc, les organismes qu'on a connus, que j'ai mentionnés, donc Réaction Sida, ACT UP Montréal, ont pas fait très long feu. Dans un troisième temps, la reconnaissance de l'homosexualité est encore fragile dans la société québécoise au moment où émerge l'épidémie au Québec. Donc, ça, ce n'est pas nécessairement quelque chose qui était unique au Québec, mais ce contexte va quand même se distinguer par ses effets sur la réponse au sida. Donc, au Québec, on observe rapidement une déshomosexualisation de la lutte contre le sida. Comme je le mentionnais tout à l'heure, le premier organisme communautaire de lutte contre le sida, Mark Arms, qui était donc un organisme bilingue, prend aussi racine dans le mouvement gay. Mais avec la création de ces armes et le changement de paradigme qu'on observe en 85 avec la francisation du mouvement, on va aussi voir une universalisation des objets, donc c'est-à-dire que ça devient une organisation pour tous et pas spécifiquement pour la communauté gay. Donc, en fait, l'idée de ne pas s'associer publiquement à l'homosexualité était de rejoindre toutes les personnes vivant avec le VIH, y compris celles qui n'auraient pas nécessairement été prêtes à s'associer à quelque chose d'homosexuel, que ce soit autant des membres de la communauté gay ou des membres des autres communautés touchées. Donc, en fait, l'ambivalence qui persistait à cette époque dans la société québécoise par rapport à l'homosexualité a donc affecté les collaborations entre les mouvements de lutte contre le sida et celui pour les droits des gays. Cela a également nui à la mise en place de services de prévention orientés vers les homosexuels. En effet, les autorités sanitaires qui étaient en charge de faire cette prévention ont rencontré des résistances du gouvernement, comme on pourrait s'y attendre, mais ils ont donc cherché à avoir des partenaires au sein de la communauté. Et comme il n'y avait pas de groupe qui s'occupait spécifiquement de la question gay, ils ont aussi eu de la difficulté à trouver ces partenaires-là pour faire la prévention. Désolée. Donc, en fait, en conclusion, désolée, le contexte québécois jette un nouvel éclairage sur la notion de retard dans la mobilisation contre le VIH-Sida qui a été observé dans presque tous les pays industrialisés, puisqu'il s'explique au Québec par des éléments qui lui sont spécifiques. Mes recherches ont aussi permis de faire ressortir l'importance, en fait, que l'importance du retard dans la lutte contre le sida doit être nuancée par le concept d'urgence, qui constitue un thème beaucoup plus riche de sens pour les participants qui ont vécu cette période. Donc, ça conclut ma présentation. Je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre attention et je vais prendre les questions si jamais il y en a.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Marian?
And like I said, you can ask questions in English.
In English, yes. So while people are preparing to ask the question, my question is, how does Quebec compare to the rest of Canada in terms of HIV these days?
These days?
Yeah.
I have to say that my research focused a lot on the early years of the epidemic. So that would really mean up until the arrival of antiretroviral therapy in 1996.
Right.
So I'm not exactly aware of the numbers in Canada as of today. Although I do think that as it was back in the days, Quebec would still be well, maybe not the majority, but not necessarily proportionally to its population, because I know that for many years, Quebec had a lot of the cases in Canada, even though it's not like the majority of the population that's in Quebec necessarily. So I'm sorry that I don't have quite the answer for you for your question.
That's fine. That's fine. Are there any questions? I'm looking at the chat box. So could you explain some more about why you thought the integration with the gay and other groups kind of led to the prevention of strict gay strategies for HIV?
I'm sorry, what was your question about? It was about prevention and the gay
how trying to combine both gay and, let me use the word, straight organizations led to the slowing down of gay targeted strategies?
Right. So because, as I said, there was the people that had to do the prevention, because the community groups we had here in Quebec, of course, prevention was one of their goals, but they had so much to do with so little means, in part because of the money that the government in Quebec wasn't really giving the community groups, that they did not have the resources to do a lot of the prevention. So I know that the government, that's well, most importantly, public health services here in Quebec, their role was to do the prevention, and they just couldn't find the partners in the community to do this prevention, because of course they didn't have they weren't seen as people that could do it in the community. What I'm saying is the community didn't see them. They weren't credible actors in the prevention in the gay community, and they had a hard time finding the partners that would accompany them in this community. That was, of course, a bit harder to reach if you didn't know anything about it.
All right. Okay. Very good. Nadia is saying, have you published your findings? She would like to read some more.
Oh, not yet, because I am currently, this study is ongoing, but I will be publishing probably before the end of the year. So anyone who's interested in, they can write me. So I will leave my email address in the chat box or on the page. So if anyone wants to write to me, and I can send my research once it's been published.
All right. Rebecca says, great job.
Thank you.
Anyway, so we are going to move ahead to our next presentation. Where am I now? And it's Alex. Alex is going to talk to us about barriers and facilitators assessing HIV health services among 2S LGBTQ+ street-involved youth in Canada. Alex, go for it. Again, I'll disappear and show up when you have probably 1 minute to 10 minutes, and then we'll take it from there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. Obviously, just let me know if there's any issues here, but I'm assuming that everything worked out just fine.
It's looking good.
Okay, great. So my name is Alex Abramovic, and I go by he and him pronouns. I'm a scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And and I'm joining you from the city of Toronto. And so my presentation today is going to focus on early findings, on preliminary findings of an ongoing multi-site implementation science study, which is being led by Dr. Paula Breitstein, and I'm the Toronto site PI. And so my presentation today is going to focus on the barriers and facilitators to accessing HIV health services among 2S LGBTQ+ street-involved youth in Canada. So before I get started and share the preliminary findings, I would like to start off with some background information regarding the issue of 2S LGBTQ youth homelessness, just to provide some context. So in recent years, all levels of government have started to show an increased interest in understanding the health of 2S LGBTQ individuals across Canada. And this is a result of many years of community advocacy, activism, and research. 2S LGBTQ individuals face unique challenges accessing safe and inclusive housing options, and are disproportionately represented among those experiencing homelessness across Canada. When I say disproportionately represented, I'm talking about up to 40% of the homeless youth population in Canada identify as 2S LGBTQ. Identity-based family conflict resulting from a young person coming out as 2S LGBTQ is really the most frequently cited reason that queer and trans youth experience homelessness. There are additional factors, of course, which include exiting public systems such as child welfare system and juvenile justice system into homelessness, unstable and insufficient employment, poverty, and racism. 2S LGBTQ youth tend to experience homelessness at younger ages and for longer and more frequent episodes compared to heterosexual and cisgender youth. And this makes it more difficult to successfully exit homelessness in the long run, resulting in chronic homelessness as adults. Some 2S LGBTQ individuals are more likely to experience homelessness and poverty compared to others. So for example, racialized, queer, and trans individuals experience homelessness at disproportionate rates. And this is an issue which is often conceptualized as a big city problem, which it most certainly is not, because 2S LGBTQ individuals exist everywhere in rural and urban communities across the country. Homelessness, discrimination, and social stigma have serious consequences on the health and well-being of 2S LGBTQ people, leading to significant mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and suicide, and increased alcohol and substance use. Youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability are at increased risk of contracting HIV compared to their stably housed peers, with 2S LGBTQ youth disproportionately impacted, especially young Black transgender women who experience high rates of discrimination and violence, making it very difficult for them to navigate institutional settings such as the healthcare system and housing system. 2S LGBTQ youth are at greater risk of contracting sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections due to a variety of factors, including age, socioeconomic status, housing status, barriers accessing healthcare, and engagement in practices that could elevate HIV exposure, such as transactional sex, condomless sex, injection drug use. So the objective of my presentation today is to describe the barriers and facilitators of accessing HIV prevention, testing, and treatment as part of phase 1 of an ongoing mixed method study on adapting and scaling up peer navigators to increase uptake and utilization of HIV care among street-involved youth. So the Peer Navigator Project, or we refer to it as the PNP, is a multi-site study that takes place across 5 sites. So there are 2 sites in Kenya, Eldoret, Hirmera, and Kitale, and in Toronto there are 3 sites as well. There are in Canada, there are 3 sites: Toronto, Montreal, and London. And each site has a different sort of focus population. And so the Montreal and Toronto site focus on 2S LGBTQ youth in particular. Semi-structured interviews and focus groups were conducted with a range of participants, including street-involved youth aged 16 to 29, healthcare providers, and community stakeholders. Interviews and focus group data were analyzed using the socio-ecological model to understand the barriers and facilitators to accessing HIV health services among street-involved youth. And when I say street-involved youth, I'm referring to youth who are indeed street involved. So they may be accessing, drop-in services, they might be couch surfing, and then young people who are also experiencing homelessness. So they may be, staying at an emergency shelter or a transitional housing program. So there are a variety of definitions, obviously, for street-involved and homelessness. And so the findings that I present to you today are based on the Montreal and Toronto sites, which specifically focus on 2S LGBTQ youth, while the other sites, as I mentioned, focus on the general population of street-involved youth at those particular sites. So with regards to the peer navigators, there was consensus among 2S LGBTQ youth participants regarding the importance of seeing their identities reflected in the peer navigators, in addition to the services that they access. The peer navigators that were hired in Toronto and Montreal identify as 2S LGBTQ and have lived experience of homelessness. Community project partners at each site hire and train peer navigators to provide support, to make referrals, and to accompany youth to appointments and provide information on harm reduction and HIV testing and prevention. I do want to note, though, that the findings that I'm going to be presenting to you shortly focus on pre-implementation of the peer navigator. So there's the peer navigator, the implementation of the peer navigator, and then there are the findings, which I'm going to be talking about right now, with regards to access to services. So our findings were divided into themes within the 5 levels of the socio-ecological model, which include societal, public policy, institutional, interpersonal, and intrapersonal levels. However, in the interest of time, I'm going to be sharing with you the main barriers and facilitators to accessing HIV health services that have been identified among 2S LGBTQ youth in Toronto and Montreal, which certainly focus on all 5 levels. So the main barriers reported by youth include lack of 2S LGBTQ population-based or specialty health services, lack of 2S LGBTQ inclusive care in the health services that are currently available. So not, specialty clinics, but just overall services. And then, of course, their basic needs not being met. So, for example, inadequate housing and not being able to access food. Ongoing intersectional stigma in everyday life related to a variety of factors was a really big sort of finding reported by youth. So, for example, youth reported HIV stigma, stigma related to sexual and gender identity, race, and mental health. And systemic barriers, including widespread homophobic and transphobic discrimination across healthcare settings, healthcare services, such as refusal to use a person's chosen name or their pronouns, but rather insisting on referring to them by the name that was listed on their health card or their government issued ID. And of course, having these types of experiences would really impact anybody, especially a young person experiencing homelessness, and would certainly result in major barriers to accessing these services. So, for example, one young participant stated, "A lot of doctors are just very dismissive of our identity, and it's like, oh, you're trans, but I'm going to call you she, and I'm going to do this," and just really being condescending. That's why a lot of queer people don't want to seek healthcare or go to the doctors, because a lot of the doctors are still very close-minded and they don't respect pronouns and all that stuff. So they just rather not. And of course, there are some differences between the 2 sites, between the Toronto and Montreal sites with regards to these findings. And if there's time after, I could speak a little bit about some of those differences. So the main facilitators to HIV health services that were reported by 2S LGBTQ youth participants included having supportive relationships with friends, family, and healthcare providers, 2S LGBTQ inclusive healthcare services, as well as population-based healthcare services was an important one as well. Accessible healthcare services, so for example, delivering healthcare in shelters and drop-in programs, making it really accessible, making it really easy to access those services, not having to travel across town, for example. And then, of course, being able to see their identity reflected in the services that they access was huge, including seeing their identity reflected on intake forms, being able to connect with a diverse team of healthcare workers as well. So to share an example of some of these facilitators, I'm going to share a quote with you. One young person said, "I feel like having a stable environment that also happens to have everything else they need would be really helpful. Like if they're constantly having to bring their things with them because they don't have anywhere to be, then maybe their medication could get lost in the process. So having a place where they can literally pick up the medication every day, it creates some sort of stability. Having a space that's LGBTQ specific so that they can feel safe. It sounds like a utopia to me." There are various types of interventions that show promise at targeting HIV risk behaviors and access to care among street-involved youth, including peer navigator interventions and inclusive and affirming population-based health services. However, it's not enough to create a couple of these types of clinics, a couple of specialized services, and think that that's going to solve the problem and that's going to meet everybody's needs. I often speak about the importance of creating a standardized model of care, which is necessary for us to create inclusive and affirming healthcare environments, and is highlighted by the findings that I've shared with you today. It allows people to know what to expect when they access health services, which is often an issue for so many 2S LGBTQ people, especially if access to inclusive and affirming care depends on who is working on any given day. This involves asking all clients their chosen name and their pronouns on institutional forms, including intake forms, and not just asking these questions, but also respecting. Doing ethical work involves asking the right questions and ensuring that we ask inclusive questions that actually capture people's identities. If we don't ask inclusive questions, then we're not collecting accurate data and we end up erasing people. And this is, how we see, institutional erasure time and time again. What's key is that people see themselves reflected in the response options rather than constantly forcing people into categories that don't represent who they are. Ensuring that services include all gender washrooms, it's so basic, and it's unbelievable that we still have to talk about this today, that we're still hearing youth, report these issues, going to a clinic, not being able to access, something as simple as a bathroom because they are, once again, gendered. And of course, equipping services with 2S LGBTQ inclusive and affirming resources. And then, of course, mandatory 2S LGBTQ inclusion training for all staff to help ensure that staff operate from a similar framework so that 2S LGBTQ people can spend less time worrying about whether or not a clinic will be inclusive. And these are just some of the early sort of recommendations that are coming up that can help create inclusive healthcare environments where people can actually bring their full authentic selves. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. Oh, Isaac, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, your time is up actually. So there's one quick question from Stephen, but I think Stephen wants to know whether you see more needed for transitional reintegration intervention programs.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Whether you see, is there more needed for transitional reintegration intervention programs? For the question is pretty long. Stephen says, not just being for instance, an ex-prisoner living with HIV, I see my research can be redesigned for all HIV clients and ex-prisoners. Can you see such a program helping transitional youth age between 30 to 39? Does it make sense?
Okay. I'm having a hard time, but I can try to respond. I'm not sure that I actually really understood the question necessarily, but
let me try again. There's a second comment here. I think it is more transitional youth needs. It is that more transitional youth needs more programming age 30 to 39.
Right.
I'm having trouble myself. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. I see. Yeah. I mean, certainly. I mean, the population who we're working with for this particular project and the work that that my program of research focuses on youth, right? So youth and young adults. So I don't work with young people up to the age of 39, but rather mostly many of the programs that I collaborate with work with youth up to the age of 24 or 25.
Oh,
but
okay.
Right. So yes, that is not a population that I necessarily work with. However, I mean, I think when we talk about 2S LGBTQ individuals, especially those who are experiencing homelessness or are street involved, there are very, very few programs, especially when we start to look at people's sort of intersectionality, and we start to think about just trying to access housing, but also trying to access healthcare, HIV prevention, treatment. There are very few programs that actually will meet all of those needs. And I think that there's a very serious needs for, within all of the age groups. I can say for certainly the young people who I work with, it's very difficult to access these services. And one last thing I will say is that oftentimes youth talk about having to pick and choose which part of their identity they will, which program they'll go to, because programs are often split. So it's like, maybe there's a program for Indigenous youth, but there's not a program necessarily for 2S LGBTQ Indigenous youth trying to access healthcare services. So it's like you have to pick and choose which part of your identity, which needs will be met when you access a program.
Okay, very quickly, did you the next question is whether there was a difference between the Toronto and Montreal side?
Oh. Okay. Yes, absolutely. So, okay. I won't get into too much detail here, but I realize I don't have a whole lot of time, but one thing that we certainly did find was the findings on the Toronto site were very much focused on like 2S LGBTQ population-based services, the need and the lack of such services, wanting to access services that were specialized, like specialized health clinics for queer and trans young people, whereas the Montreal site did not necessarily speak to those needs. Very few actually spoke to those needs, but rather spoke much more about dealing with racism and stigma related to race, which didn't necessarily come up as often in the Toronto site. And so I found that the barriers and the facilitators differed. Mainly, Toronto, the participants in Toronto speaking very clearly about wanting trans-affirming healthcare, wanting inclusive, accepting population-based services. Whereas in Montreal, it was about HIV acceptance and awareness and experiencing racism as barriers, and facilitators, HIV acceptance and awareness.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to Imre.
Thank you.
Who is going to talk to us? The title is I Do Not Have Sex Outside of Our Bubble, Risk Reduction Strategies and Changes in Sexual Practices Among Gay, Bisexual, and Queer Men in Canada during the COVID pandemic. Go for it. And I will disappear and show up when you have about 1 minute left, just to give you a hint.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just share my screen. Thank you, Isaac. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the CAHR Organizing Committee for inviting me and for everyone being here today. My name is Emrich Deroya. I go by he, him pronouns, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Shayna Skagin-Sparling, Cornel Gray, Ben Klassen, David Lazar, Jody Jollymore, Nathan Lachowski, David Moore, Jordan Sang, Gilles Lambert, Trevor Hart, Joseph Cox, Daryl Ten, and Daniel Grace. Today, I'll be presenting some findings from our Engage COVID-19 qualitative research, which is led by Dr. Daniel Grace, who is my current supervisor at U of T. The paper I'm presenting today is titled, I Did Not Have Sex Outside of Our Bubble, Changes in Sexual Practices and Risk Reduction Strategies Among Gay, Bisexual, and Queer Men in Canada During the COVID-19 Pandemic. First, a bit of background. In efforts to prevent the spread of COVID-19, jurisdictions across Canada enacted containment measures that affected gay, bisexual, and queer men's intimacy and sexual relations. Several studies had shown that sexual relations among GBQM had declined or remained the same during the early months of the pandemic. Other studies, however, indicated that some GBQM continued sexual engagements with people outside of their households or increased the number of sex partners. Some research conducted during the early stages of the pandemic, roughly between March to June 2020, found that many GBQM took precautions when engaging in sex. These measures included requesting their partners be tested for COVID-19 before sexual encounters, temporarily becoming sexually abstinent, and limiting sex to regular partners. Some even asked specific questions like, are you showing any symptoms, to screen their sex partners. For some scholars, such as Brax, Major, and Cesarni, GBQM's COVID-19 risk reduction initiatives reflected their modification of public health measures and the adaptation of their previous experiences with preventing sexually transmitted infections. The application of lessons from HIV, STI, and COVID-19 prevention illustrates GBQM's responsiveness to sexual risks by combining experiential and expert knowledge, such as public health directives, into practical strategies. This demonstrates GBQM's ability to incorporate medical opinion into their embodied practices, which represents what Kane Weiss has called reflexive mediation. So our objective for this paper was to investigate how urban GBQM changed their sexual behaviors and what strategies they've implemented when engaging in sexual relations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now I'll be speaking briefly about the methods of our study. Engage COVID-19 is embedded within the ongoing Engage cohort, a mixed method study of GBQM living in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Engage COVID-19's objective was to examine the impacts of COVID-19 on the physical, sexual, and mental health of urban GBQM in Canada. Engage COVID-19 consisted of three components: quantitative COVID-19 antibody testing and qualitative interviews. For the qualitative interviews, we aim to capture the diverse experiences of GBQM, so we recruited participants along 5 key categories: age, ethno-racial background, gender, sexual identity, and HIV status. 93 in-depth qualitative interviews were conducted in 2 rounds, between November 2020 to February 2021 and June to October 2021. One-on-one interviews were conducted virtually using MS Teams, lasting between 30 to 120 minutes. Interviews were conducted in English or French, depending on participants' preferences. We used NVivo to code the interviews using thematic analysis. Now the results. Majority of our participants were in their 30s, making up 40%, 20s at 22%, and 40s at 13%. 36 of participants self-identified as white, 24% were mixed race, 16% were East Southeast Asian, 8% were Black, 6% were Latin American, and 3% Middle Eastern and South Asian, respectively. The vast majority self-identified as cisgender, making up about 82% of the participants, and 70% self-identified as gay. 21.5% were living with HIV. Now I'm going to speak about some of the results from our thematic analysis. Across the 3 cities, GBQM reported changes to sexual practices in response to COVID-19 public health measures and shifting pandemic contexts, such as fluctuations in COVID-19 cases, changes in restrictions, and availability of vaccinations. During the early periods of the pandemic, some single participants who were sexually active pre-pandemic reported temporarily abstaining from in-person sexual engagements. Several single participants, however, described participating in virtual sex. And among a small number of couples, a time-limited closure of open relationships was reported. However, there was an increase in sexual activities when COVID-19 infections were lower and some restrictions were relaxed. When vaccinations became widely available and most restrictions were eased, participants reported resuming sexual engagements. For the next results, I'll be speaking about the strategies implemented by our participants to prevent COVID-19 during sexual encounters. Almost a quarter of the GBQM we interviewed reported continuing casual sexual relations with significantly reduced number of sex partners, and often with partners they already knew and trusted. A few of our participants described this strategy as sex bubbles, borrowing language from COVID-19 public health messaging around social bubbles. For example, this participant from Vancouver said that he decided to be bubbled with a guy who lived alone like himself. He explained that creating a sex bubble was meant to limit his exposure to COVID-19 because he trusted that his sex partner was only seeing him. He further described that the creation of a sex bubble was a direct response to public health directives on gathering limits. As he said, the rules allowed for 1 or 2 people in a bubble at the time of his interview. Another strategy our participants talked about was screening partners. Some of the people we interviewed reported inquiring about COVID-19 symptoms and safety behaviors to screen potential sex partners. For example, a self-identified Latin American participant from Toronto explained that screening had become a thing to ask. He asked his partners about their safety behaviors, including how often they go out and if they use a mask when going out. The second individual shared that as part of his sexual screening process, he discussed requiring proof of a COVID-19 negative test. And he said that if they have proof, he'd be down to go ahead and have sex. And the last participant from Montreal described asking potential partners if they had tested for COVID-19 or if they were showing any COVID-19 symptoms. In conjunction with COVID-19 screening, he also asked his sex partners about STDs. This reference to STDs demonstrates how knowledge about safer sex strategies to prevent HIV/STI transmission lends itself to COVID-19 risk reduction among some of our participants. Mask wearing was another strategy some participants adopted when engaging in sex earlier in the pandemic. For example, this participant from Vancouver reported that a couple of times he got fucked, he and his partner were both wearing masks. A man from Montreal shared that his sex partner insisted on engaging only in oral sex because wearing a mask for anal sex was impractical. One final strategy our participants described was vaccine sorting. participants who reported double vaccination status described resuming sexual engagements with partners who at least had one, ideally 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. For example, one man from Toronto said that he had received 2 doses of the vaccine, and he also made sure that his partners also had received their vaccines. Another participant compared vaccine sorting to HIV prevention. In particular, he likened it to PrEP sorting or viral load sorting. So in conclusion, the accounts of our participants reveal that they adopted and modified COVID-19 public health measures to continue engaging in casual sexual behaviors confidently. Social bubbles were changed to sex bubbles, and masks were turned into safer sex tools. Our findings illustrate that GBQM have used their acquired knowledge from HIV, STI, and COVID-19 prevention to mitigate sexual risks during the pandemic. In particular, screening partners for COVID-19 symptoms were implemented alongside asking partners about their HIV, STI status. Vaccine sorting as a risk reduction strategy specific for COVID-19 was described to work similarly to the logics of HIV sorting strategies, including viral load sorting and PrEP sorting. The incorporation and adaptation of COVID-19 public health knowledge and directives into techniques of sexual safety reflect a form of reflexive mediation. That is, instead of just applying health directives in a top-down fashion, developing preventative behaviors required our participants' inventiveness in transforming public health policies into practical strategies to ensure safer sex, not only from HIV STIs, but also from COVID-19. One strength of our studies that expands our knowledge about the strategies implemented by GBQM to prevent COVID-19 during sexual encounters by offering cross-jurisdictional data from 2 different time points during the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada. As a result, our study offers an overview of the changes in sexual practices from when COVID-19 restrictions were severe up to the point when COVID-19 vaccines became widely available, allowing us to study how vaccines were incorporated by GBQM into sexual practices. One limitation is that our study only interviewed GBQM living in large urban areas. Therefore, future studies should focus on the experiences of GBQM living in rural and suburban settings. And those are our references. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. And I'd also like to acknowledge our funders, collaborators, our participants, and community partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Emeric. Very good. We have time for a couple of questions. If you have your question, if you can type it in. So it seems everyone is still thinking. So what do you think, with all of us, the long-term effect of COVID, which is not going away, how will that influence some of the strategies that you describe in from your participants?
So I guess one of the long-term effects is for community organizations to, I guess, keep on promoting safer sex strategies that were not particularly addressed by public health, but was invented by gay and bisexual men in our participants during COVID-19 pandemic. And also to acknowledge that gay men have the capacity to invent safer sex practices, adapting I guess, public health directives and public health knowledge about COVID-19 and potentially other pandemics in the future.
Yeah. Good. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, thank you very much. Very, very good work. We will move to our next presenter.
Thank you.
That is Alison. So Alison, I'll disappear and show up again when you have about a minute left.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for being here today. My name is Alison Kirschbaum. I am a clinical psychology research postdoctoral fellow at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson University. I worked there with Trevor Hart in the HIV prevention lab. And Trevor and Nick Matheny, who is a professor at the University of Miami, were my two primary co-authors on this study. I'm presenting today a project I've been working on looking at bidirectional intimate partner violence among sexual minority men in Canada. Intimate partner violence, for this current study, we conceptualize IPV, or relationship violence, intimate partner violence, as physical, sexual, and/or psychological violence that happens in the context of a sexual and/or romantic relationship. Examples of physical IPV are hitting, kicking, slapping. Sexual IPV includes things like sexual abuse, coercion, rape, and psychological or emotional relationship violence, which tends to be the most common form of violence, includes things like insults, controlling behaviors, verbal abuse. We measured IPV in terms of lifetime. Have you ever perpetrated or been a victim of any of these? And IPV can be either 1, 2, or 3 of these types. This is why the and/or is bolded here. It tends to be more than one type, and it can also be perpetration and/or victimization, or both. It's the both part that tends to happen more often in men's same-sex relationships, and that's what we're interested in for the purposes of the current study. IPV is associated with HIV risk and HIV infection. Both IPV victimization and perpetration are associated with higher numbers of condomless anal sex partners, higher likelihood of not using a condom at the last sexual encounter. Being HIV positive is associated also with a higher likelihood of bidirectional IPV. IPV happens frequently among sexual minority men. These rates are from a recently published meta-analysis, which also measured IPV in terms of lifetime experiences and used the same definition that we did, that is physical, sexual, and/or emotional violence. You can see the rates of both victimization and perpetration are quite high. They did not investigate, however, bidirectional intimate partner violence, which is the experience of IPV victimization and perpetration. Most studies looking at IPV among sexual minority men looks only at victimization. Sometimes it looks at victimization and perpetration, but bidirectional IPV, despite many studies showing that it's more common than victimization or perpetration alone, is not investigated very frequently. However, studies that have looked at it find that among participants reporting IPV, as high as half or maybe even the majority of these participants are reporting both victimization and perpetration, indicating that this is potentially a significant public health problem among sexual minority men. So the theories that we used for our study, we investigated known risk factors for IPV among sexual minority men. These are known to be risk factors mostly for victimization, some of them for perpetration too, but like I said, bidirectional IPV hasn't been investigated very often, but we believed that these risk factors would also be significant risk factors for bidirectional IPV. So we looked more specifically at childhood sexual abuse, depression, and substance use, including problematic alcohol use, as well as illegal drug use. We also employed syndemic theory, which states that experiencing multiple risk factors compounds the risk. Syndemic theory hasn't been used very often in IPV research, especially not when investigating bidirectional IPV, but we hypothesized that experiencing multiple of these risk factors listed here would potentially increase the chances at which our participants would report experiences with bidirectional IPV. So I am reporting data from the Engage cohort study. Similar to Emrich's presentation, I'm using the full sample from the baseline data collection. The Engage study is a mixed methods longitudinal cohort study. Data is collected in the 3 largest urban centers of Canada. Participants are all 16 or over, sexually active, sexual minority men, who they complete a questionnaire online, and then they also do STI and HIV testing. So we collect biological data, and the data are collected using respondent-driven sampling. It's a fairly large sample. It's about 2,500 guys. So we used 3 different logistic regressions in order to compare and contrast the different models. The first model, we looked at the individual syndemic factors as predictors of IPV. Again, the syndemic factors or the risk factors that we were investigating are childhood sexual abuse, depression, drug use, and problematic alcohol use. Our outcome variable is bidirectional IPV. So this means we were comparing participants that reported bidirectional IPV, meaning both victimization and perpetration, to guys who reported either no IPV or victimization or perpetration only. In the second model, we used an additive approach and calculated how many of the syndemic factors each participant had reported to see if there was a difference between reporting 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, in terms of increased risk of reporting bidirectional IPV. In the third model, we used a logistic regression again to measure interaction terms of all possible interactions of the 4 syndemic variables to show the predicted probability of reporting bidirectional IPV for every possible combination of these 4 syndemic factors. And we used the same control variables in each model, including age, ethnicity, immigration status, financial strain, city, whether there is a current sexual relationship partner, HIV status, and number of sex partners in the past 6 months. And then we do use inverse probability weights to account for the RDS recruitment methods. Just a brief rundown of the descriptive highlights of the study. You can see that more than half the sample reported problematic alcohol use and illegal drug use in the past 6 months. There's also a particularly high rate of childhood sexual abuse reported among our sample. Psychological or emotional IPV was the most commonly endorsed kind of IPV. And you can see the bidirectional IPV, or reporting both perpetration and victimization, was fairly common. 31% of our sample reported both. And this was more than perpetration only. 3% of our sample reported only perpetration. 18% of our sample reported only victimization. So in the first model, again, we examined each of the syndemic factors individually in terms of their predictive association with bidirectional IPV. So as you can see here, participants reporting childhood sexual abuse were nearly twice as likely to have reported bidirectional IPV than participants reporting no childhood sexual abuse. Similarly, participants reporting depressive symptoms were nearly twice as likely to have reported bidirectional IPV than were participants not reporting any depressive symptoms. So each of these risk factors were significantly associated with bidirectional IPV when we examined them individually. Again, in the second model, we totaled the number of factors that participants had reported. There were so few participants reporting all 4 syndemic factors that we had to combine 3 and 4 into a single category. However, you can see that participants reporting 3 or 4 of these syndemic factors were more than 4 times more likely to report bidirectional IPV than participants reporting none of these syndemic factors. So this is the same as model 1, it's just the risk factors are collapsed. And so it's a count, sort of a total instead. but participants reporting one or more of these risk factors were each significantly more likely to report bidirectional IPV than participants not reporting any of these syndemic factors. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but I'm gonna walk you through it here. This is the third model where, again, we examined the interactions of every possible combination of these syndemic factors. And you can see here that we can expect someone with none of these factors to have about a 14% chance of reporting bidirectional IPV, 14% or 13.7%. This increases significantly to 35.5% when someone reports depressive symptoms only and none of the other factors. However, we can see this relationship isn't necessarily linear. Instead, the combinations of different syndemic factors tell a little bit more of a nuanced story of which of these factors lead to the greatest odds of reporting bidirectional IPV. For instance, we can see that problematic alcohol use alone leads to about a 17% chance of reporting bidirectional IPV. That's only 3% higher than those reporting no syndemic factors. But when alcohol use is combined with depression, for example, this increases to about 29%, or 15% higher chances than reporting no syndemic factors. The greatest increase in bidirectional IPV risk comes from those who report childhood sexual abuse, depressive symptoms, and alcohol misuse. This group you can see here had a 57% chance of reporting bidirectional IPV. That's 44% higher than those with no syndemic factors. This can help us pinpoint which cluster of risk factors may be most important when designing interventions and when assessing which subpopulations might be most at risk. So when examined individually, again, each of the risk factors we examined were significant predictors of bidirectional IPV. Reporting 3 or 4 of them led to the highest risk. However, the greatest risk when we looked at the interaction terms was among participants reporting childhood sexual abuse, depression, and alcohol misuse, pointing to the importance of examining risk factors individually, examining them compounded or count-wise, and as interactions. Clearly conceptualizing IPV as a syndemic, in addition to many other health factors that are being examined as a syndemic, IPV should also be examined as a syndemic, allowing us to consider multiple risk factors that compound in order to lead to higher risk of violence. And again, examining interactions between the risk factors can really allow us to pinpoint the areas of intervention that might have the largest effect, both on reducing violence, but also again on reducing HIV risk behaviors in this population. So just some quick limitations. We did use cross-sectional data, which is a limit for almost all violence data in LGBT populations, unfortunately. However, the ENGAGE study will be able to provide some of the very first longitudinal insights into the drivers and the impacts of violence among sexual minority men, which is definitely will someday be a strength, coming soon. We measured IPV across lifetime and across partnerships. So this does mean that we're not able to determine if perpetration and victimization experiences happen in the same relationship or even with the same partner. But we were using the theories I mentioned before to drive the analyses and choose the variables. Our results point to the importance of providers considering IPV as often bidirectional. Remember, bidirectional IPV was more common in our sample than victimization or perpetration alone, indicating, highlighting the importance of providers assessing for both victimization and perpetration of relationship violence. Our results also point to the importance of developing interventions that address depressive symptoms, alcohol use, and childhood sexual abuse in order to be most effective at reducing both IPV and HIV risk in this population. And thank you again to all my many co-authors and our collaborators and partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. you exhausted all your time. It's now 30 seconds, so I think we will progress to our last speaker, Sylvian. If you can come up. Sylvian is going to talk to us about the stigma index of people living with HIV in Quebec. Institutional stigma, reluctance to seek HIV care after diagnosis.
Yes, thank you, Isaac. Bonjour everyone. Kwayemzewik, Take Olepan. Mon nom est Sylvain Baudry. Je suis coordonnateur de recherche sur le projet de recherche de l'index de stigmatisation des personnes vivant avec le VIH au Québec. Je travaille à la CAHR. Je vais présenter en français, mais la plupart des diapos sont en anglais aussi ou bilingue, donc je pourrai répondre aux questions. I can answer questions in English also after, if we have time. So, ici l'équipe de recherche du Québec. Donc, j'aimerais reconnaître que je fais cette présentation à partir des territoires non cédés de la nation canadienne CAHR. Un bref aperçu du projet de recherche dans le monde. Il existe depuis 2008. Il a été mis en œuvre dans plus de 100 pays et traduit en 54 langues. Plus de 20 000 personnes vivant avec le VIH 2 000 personnes plutôt, ont été formées pour être pairs associés de recherche et plus de 100 000 personnes ont été interrogées. Au Canada, c'est mené par la Sound Practice sur le VIH-Sida des IRRC. Est financé par les instituts de recherche en santé du Canada et l'Agence de santé publique du Canada. Le projet existe dans plusieurs provinces, Colombie-Britannique, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, Québec et les provinces maritimes. Aussi. Au Québec, il est mené par la CAHR en collaboration avec l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Nous avons interrogé 281 personnes vivant avec le VIH. La durée de l'entretien était d'environ 2 heures. Et nous avions une équipe de 9 pairs associés de recherche vivant avec le VIH qui ont reçu une formation pour pouvoir faire la collecte de données et participer activement au développement du projet. Le questionnaire quantitatif fait face à face ou côte à côte. C'était avant la COVID, donc en 2019, et la collecte de données a duré 7 mois. Nos participantes étaient âgées environ entre 19 et 79 ans avec une moyenne de 52 ans. 61% d'hommes cis ou identifiés comme hommes cis, 34% identifiés comme femmes cis, 5% de personnes trans, non-binaires, queer, spirituels ou autres. 49% étaient hétérosexuels, 36% s'identifiaient comme hommes gays ou homosexuels, 10% de bisexuels, 2% pansexuels, 2% queer et 1% bispirituels. 62% avaient un revenu annuel inférieur à 20 000 $ et 58% étaient célibataires. Et les années de diagnostic étaient entre 1983 à 2019 avec une moyenne de 19 ans de vie avec le VIH. Pour les facteurs d'hésitation, avant de demander des soins ou des traitements spécifiques au VIH, c'est par ordre d'importance. À 45%, c'était de ne pas être prêt à faire face à sa séropositivité. 43%, c'était d'avoir eu une mauvaise expérience avec un professionnel de la santé dans le passé. Craindre que d'autres personnes de son entourage apprennent sa séropositivité à 31%. Et avoir peur que des professionnels de la santé vous manquent de respect, 28% ont répondu oui. Avoir peur que des professionnels de la santé révèlent sa séropositivité sans son consentement, 27% ont répondu oui. Craindre que partenaires, famille ou amis apprennent sa séropositivité à 23% et craindre qu'une situation d'handicap limite l'accès à des soins ou traitements en lien avec le VIH à 13%. Le facteur d'hésitation a demandé des soins données descriptives, l'analyse bivariée réalisée. Un score moyen plus élevé sur les facteurs d'hésitation a demandé des soins pour le VIH est observé chez les personnes qui rapportent parler une autre langue que le français et chez les personnes qui rapportent la présence de symptômes de dépression. Un score moyen plus élevé sur l'échelle des facteurs d'hésitation a demandé des soins ou des traitements. Pour le VIH, est observé chez les personnes qui ont un score moyen plus élevé sur l'échelle de stigmatisation intériorisée, anticipée, institutionnelle et sur l'échelle de discrimination dans le cadre de soins VIH. Un score moyen plus élevé aussi sur les facteurs d'hésitation a demandé des soins pour le VIH est observé chez les personnes qui ont un score moyen plus faible sur l'échelle de soutien social reçu. Sur les facteurs d'hésitation, ici, facteurs associés à analyse multivariée. Multivarié indique qu'un score plus élevé sur l'échelle des facteurs d'hésitation est associé à un score plus élevé sur l'échelle de stigmatisation anticipée ressentie actuellement. Un score plus élevé sur l'échelle de discrimination vécue dans les 12 derniers mois dans le cadre de soins VIH et un score plus élevé sur l'échelle de stigmatisation intériorisée ressentie actuellement. En conclusion, les facteurs d'hésitation à demander des soins après le diagnostic se traduisent par la suite sous forme de stigmatisation anticipée et intériorisée vécue au moment de l'enquête. Cela souligne l'importance de renforcer les PVVIH, chez les PVVIH, leur estime d'elles-mêmes comme personne à part entière et qui ne se limite pas à être un virus, à être VIH, de tenir compte des craintes anticipées au dévoilement et les démystifier pour aider la personne à faire face de façon proactive. Pour le professionnel de la santé, d'explorer dès l'annonce de la séropositivité les craintes que la personne vivant avec le VIH quant aux soins et aux traitements à venir et d'instaurer auprès de celle-ci un climat de confiance et de bienveillance. Les facteurs d'hésitation sont aussi associés à plus de discrimination vécue dans les 12 derniers mois, spécifiquement dans le contexte de soins VIH. Ceci pourrait être le reflet d'un manque de sensibilité de la part des professionnels de la santé, des enjeux intersectionnels qui entretiennent de façon récurrente les stigmatisations intériorisées et anticipées. La formation continue du personnel de la santé aux enjeux liés à la discrimination envers les personnes vivant avec le VIH reste une priorité. Merci. Olé, olé.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you finished on time, so we have time for a couple of questions. So Sylvia, now let me ask a question. Over and over and over, everywhere, like your study findings, we see that people are still scared of healthcare providers. Let me use the word. What can we do? Everywhere you go, healthcare providers just seem to be one of the obstacles to to help it. They should be the one helping us, and they're the ones scaring us off. How do we navigate this issue that is over and over and over again?
Yeah, I think we need to keep the training for professionals and in awareness of it's still something that you don't discuss with the patient in open space, or someone told me that he received his diagnosis from his doctor with a team of students. And they went outside of the room and they continued the discussion in the open space. You see, this person just gave blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So just being more sensitive about caring and privacy of the person.
Yeah. Oh, very good. Are there any other questions? It's a long day. If there are no other questions, then we will declare our session ended. Right on time, actually. Which is very good, 4:30, yeah. If there's no burning questions, then it's done. Thank you all very much. Very, very, very strong session.